Okay, I spent way too long in Pompeii, so now we need to rush. You know that the Romans overthrew their Etruscan kings and became a republic in 6th century BCE. Rome then proceeded to conquer the surrounding Italian cities, and then, over the next 150 years, Rome gained control of the hugely wealthy Greek colonies on what is now called the island of Sicily. Next, they fought a long and bloody battle with Carthage for control of the Mediterranean. The map shows the area that the Romans controlled by 215 BCE in red. From an art history standpoint, the conquest of the Greek colonies in Sicily was hugely important. Why? Well, the Roman army hauled back wagon loads of Greek sculpture and its citizens were hooked. From there on, Romans would be dedicated collectors and imitators of Greek art. Sorry, this is a complicated slide, but I have a lot of information to try to convey pretty quickly. Imperium is a vital concept in Roman history. It's the word that becomes the root of emperor and imperial, but what it really means is the power and authority that a government ruler wields. Roman art is all about power and authority. Power in Rome was in fact complicated, and it was often up for grabs. The two executive rulers, the consuls, were selected by and ruled, at least in theory, with the consent of the Senate, a group of powerful older men from noble families. In times of crisis, and warlike Rome faced a lot of crises, the consuls could appoint a dictator and hand all power over to him for 6 months. Roman patricians, that's the term for their nobles or leading families, competed for political and military leadership, which conferred dignitas. While this is the root of our word dignity, it meant much more. It meant status, honor, public popularity, importance, being cool, if you will. This was what Roman leaders sought, and sometimes at the expense of republican principles. There were a lot of dictators. It's a good term for you to remember because much Roman art attempts to capture or reinforce or communicate this quality of dignitas. By the way, the same pattern was repeated inside the Roman family. The father, or paterfamilias, literally had the power of life and death over his children, and something pretty close to the power of life and death over his wife. The patricians, or nobles again, in turn ruled over the plebeian free citizens, and everyone ruled over the society's many slaves. Roman Republican portraiture was all about dignitas. Roman patrician society was obsessed with lineage. Noble families actually kept wax images of their ancestors, called imagines, in a cupboard in their homes. The statue on the right shows a patrician with busts of his ancestors. Oops. There it comes up. The status that came with age or lineage is reflected in veristic or truthful art. It's actually a slightly odd term because often this art was not entirely truthful. There's some evidence that subjects may have asked that their wrinkles be exaggerated to convey age and experience. Nevertheless, think of the contrast with Greek sculptural ideals that reflect a different set of values. Less, the Romans worshipped youth and beauty less. They admired the wisdom that comes from age more. This is not a required work, but it's really rather weird, and veristic portraiture could get weird. So this general's portrait combined the age and wisdom in his facial features with a body that presumably was intended to convey vigor and physical strength. Very strange. So let's continue our breakneck race through Roman history with a video clip about Caesar Augustus, the fall of the Roman Republic, and the rise of the empire. I thought the video did a good job of highlighting Augustus's career, but let me emphasize just a few points. First, along with Napoleon, Augustus was the master of using art as political propaganda, as a tool not only to express, but even more to bolster his power and authority. He probably noted the mistakes of his famous uncle Julius Caesar, and at any rate he tried not to repeat them. So he treated the Roman patricians, especially the senators, with a flawless respect that almost disguised the reality that he had stripped them of all but symbolic power. He consciously manipulated a widespread public desire, really in all classes, to return to the somewhat mythical days of the virtuous republic. But he also recognized that he wasn't going to be able to use age and experience to justify the legitimacy of his rule. Not when he was just 20 years old when he first assumed power as part of the triumvirate of rulers, and just 28 when he became Rome's sole ruler. So he turned to another tradition, ancient Greece. So what similarities and what differences do you see between these two famous statues? And, perhaps more importantly, what's behind the differences? The idealized male bodies are actually rather similar. Look at the legs and feet, for example. And of course, there's that manly chest. Similarly, the contrapposto stance and the stern but beautiful faces are quite similar, but with what important differences? Augustus is facing forward at his audience, and his hand is extending out to his people as well. Augustus is, of course, also wearing clothes. So why? Well, first of all, his army uniform carried a lot of symbols. We'll see those in a minute. But Augustus also portrayed himself as returning Rome to a more virtuous, including sexually virtuous and family-oriented age. The paterfamilias of the entire empire simply kept his clothes on. As you heard in the Khan Academy podcast, I hope we see other important symbols of power and authority in this very famous statue of Augustus. So, what symbols can you identify, and how do they enhance Augustus's perceived power and authority? This is missing from the College Board image, which uses the version in the Vatican Museum. There are lots of versions of this statue. But Augustus was almost certainly carrying the baton of the office of consul in his left hand. I actually remember that it's reversed because it's mirror imaged. This was not just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of republican power. Again, Augustus claimed to be restoring the republic, not creating a new political regime, even though, of course, he was. He was establishing an empire. He's wearing the costume of a general, the Imperator, which actually means commander of the Roman army, not emperor. The leather fringe, which you see bottom right, was part of that military costume. In fact, military historians don't think that much of Augustus as a general, but he had the good sense to employ a very good general, Agrippa, and then to take credit for the victories that Agrippa pretty much won. Augustus was all about seizing the propaganda advantage. The relief on the breastplate, or cuirass, that's C-U-I-R-A-S-S, advertises the return of the Roman military standards that the Parthians, that's the successors of the Persians in the East, had captured from Augustus's rival Crassus. So notice again an allusion to ancient Greece in defeating the Persians or their heirs. There are also allusions to various Roman deities, including Mars, the god of war, as well as personifications of the latest territories conquered by Augustus: Hispania, Gaul, Germania, Parthia. The Cupid symbolized the Julian family's alleged descent from Venus, that is, Julius Caesar's descent from Venus. Cupid was another of Venus's sons. His bare feet, a little odd with the general uniform, don't you think, offered another subtle hint of Augustus's godlike state. Gods were usually depicted barefoot. I mentioned there were many copies of the statue, a little like presidents' portraits hanging in federal offices all over the country. The image in the College Board set was discovered in the 1800s, and it still bore traces of paint. It's now in the Vatican Museum, and a workshop in that museum studied these paint fragments and came up with this model of the painted statue, which actually creates, I think, quite a different impression. Okay, this one didn't make the College Board list either, even though it's a long-time AP favorite. But I think that looking only at the Augustus of the Prima Porta gives you a lopsided view of how Augustus used art for political propaganda. Almost all Roman monuments celebrate military victory in one of Rome's many imperial wars. This monument is, quite deliberately, an exception. By the time Augustus took power as princeps, or first citizen, and as imperator, commander-in-chief, and, just a little later, as pontifex maximus, or high priest, Rome had been embroiled in civil wars for a century. The citizens were tired of war. They were eager for stable, predictable rule. This monument celebrated peace, what was called the Pax Augustae and would later be called the Pax Romana. The altar, by the way, was reconstructed by the Italian dictator Mussolini, a buddy of Hitler's, in the 1930s to celebrate not only the 2000th anniversary of Augustus's birth, but also Mussolini's claim to be a new Caesar. One of the reliefs on the top panel of the altar shows a seated matron with two surprisingly realistic squirmy babies on her lap. She's usually identified as Tellus or Mother Earth. She might have been Ceres, the goddess of the harvest. What she clearly represents, though, is the bounty of the earth when the country is not being racked by war. Again, this is an altar to peace. And Augustus's desire also that Romans get down to the serious business of making more babies to defend and run the empire. So here we get a closer look at the procession frieze and a comparison with the Panathenaic frieze on the Parthenon. So how are they similar? Well, the composition is quite similar, a procession along a frieze. We also see in both a very detailed depiction of clothing, but they are different in some important ways. This was a specific event, not a regular occurrence. The royal family, moreover, is portrayed as interacting, even with children who are tugging on cloaks. Art historians debate over why kids show up on this frieze and almost no others. But one theory is, again, that Augustus was pushing fertility. Men with families set a moral example. Between this and Pompeii, this was a long day of lectures. And next day will be shorter, I promise.